and welcome to our live stream of our discussion on post-Brexit trade with the US and digital space. We'll be looking at quite a lot of really, somewhat complex but very fundamental issues about the future of our digital economy and our digital rights, particularly privacy, free expression. We have three really very knowledgeable speakers to talk about this today. We have Cory Doctorow, who many of you will know, is a Canadian-British author, digital rights activist and journalist, works for Electronic Frontier Foundation, and of course is a member of ORG, a founding member, in fact, and a member of our advisory council. We have Anna Fielder, who is the president of European Digital Rights. She's also chair of Emeritus of Privacy International and senior policy advisor, Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, which is where she does her work on digital trade. And finally, we have Damian Collins, who is a Conservative MP for Folkestone and Hythe, served as chair of the House of Commons Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee from 2016 to 2019, where he led inquiries into disinformation, fake news, and addictive and immersive technologies. So hoping Damian will join us in a bit. Meanwhile, we will hear from first Cory and then Anna. So Cory, without further ado.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. So I just wanted to sketch out a few kind of top level concepts in the history and current practice of technology regulation through international fora led by the United States. I've had a long experience of this, although I also have to admit that I have not dealt with the US Trade Representative directly in about a decade. But before that, I worked on UN treaties, internet treaties, opposite the US Trade Representative and often adverse to the US Trade Representative. So as befits data protection, I think that there are entities who worry a lot about data protection in respect to the state, and there are people who worry about data protection in respect of large commercial firms. And, the shortcut for this is that, sometimes I'll be asked to go give a talk at a place like West Point, which is a big military academy in the US, and I'll have the people there say, I had to give Uncle Sam every detail about my life to get my security clearance. I don't care about government spying, but those people at Google, they'd sell their mothers for a dime. I don't want them having any information on me. And contrariwise, I go to Silicon Valley and they say, all Google wants to do is make my ads better. That's fine with me. But the NSA is full of people who weren't smart enough to get into Google, and who knows what they'll do with my data. And I think the reality that we need to understand is that private firms collect a lot more data than is advisable or safe. And they do so in large part because they're shielded from liability when the consequences of that overcollection come home to roost, whether that's algorithmic bias, breaches, or other misuses of data. And states have remarkable forbearance when it comes to that commercial over collection. And starting with the Snowden leaks, but right up to the present day, we have a pretty obvious answer as to why states are so sanguine about the firms chartered within their borders doing this overcollection. And it's because they're effectively an adjunct of state surveillance. We see this with the NSA leaks, with the Snowden leaks, where we see that on the one hand, you had the NSA coming in the front door of the big tech firms and giving them warrants for data that were secret where they could go and access it. But then we found out through the leaks that the reason that they knew what to ask for warrants for is they were spying on literally everything that went between the big firms' data centers, so that they would then just look at all I get a little hand wavy and my headphones go flying. They would look at all of our data, figure out what to get, and then use this legal overt or legal covert method. So they had the extra covert and the covert method. And all of that amounts to this, that you cannot cleanly cleave private surveillance from public surveillance. They are in a parcel. They're a public-private partnership from hell. And the way that we eliminate state surveillance is by curbing private surveillance, and the way that we curb private surveillance is by convincing states that they should not surveil as much as they do, because then they won't have the need for those private data troves. one of the reasons that states are able to plunder so much data from large tech firms is because the lack of competition. We've had a 40-year experiment in a very dramatic change in the way that we practice competition law, where our focus has shifted from treating monopoly as a harm per se to treating monopoly as a potential source of a consumer harm, where, that is to say that prices might go up when monopolies form. And as a result, there's also been enormous forbearance when it comes to anti-competitive mergers. And this has led to a world in which the web consists of 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And what that means is that if you can suborn any one of those giant firms, you can get an appreciable slice of what you want. And both the US and the EU are actively pursuing interoperability and other competition remedies for tech. And this is very exciting to see. But one of the things that's emerging, whether that's from the DSA and the EU or some of the discussions about the Access Act and other interoperability proposals in the US, is that a privacy law is absolutely vital to it. That unless you have some standard by which certain kinds of interoperability can be deemed unlawful and illegitimate, unless you can say this person is not Cambridge Analytica or Cambridge Analytica like, and this person is, and for that you need recourse to a privacy rule, then you just open the door to effectively unlimited bad actors. And so I think that this issue of data protection is going to become much sharper in the years to come. And I want to finish by talking about my direct experience and indirect experience of the US Trade Representative and how cyber policy has been made in US history. And I'm going to give you a very whirlwind tour. So in 1995, the US decided to demilitarize the internet. Al Gore held hearings on it. He was the man who was elected president and denied his presidency in 2000. He was then a senator. And Al Gore entertained proposals from various people, including I beg your pardon, he was then the vice president. He entertained his boss's copyright czar's proposal, a guy named Bruce Lehman, who'd been chief of copyright at Microsoft, went into government in the Clinton era, and Lehman gave him a very sweeping proposal for copyright liability that would have effectively made it impossible to operate a platform for public speech without assuming unlimited liability. And basically turning the internet into cable telly. And he was sent packing. Gore, to his credit, said that's not the vision for the internet. But Lehman went to the UN. He went to WIPO, the specialized UN agency that does copyright policy, and he built the core provisions of the white paper into the WIPO copyright and the WIPO phonograms and performers treaty, which then became US law in 1998, and then became EU law in 2001 through the copyright directive. And the copyright so the DMCA goes farther than the WIPO copyright treaty. The copyright directive goes farther than the DMCA. And yet each of these were passed in the name of harmonizing with existing international norms and with trading partners. And so this upwards harmonization, where you have goals that can't get through the front door and instead are pressurized through the back door, has become a regular feature of international trade. And the USTR is very good at it. And they certainly haven't given up. So in the year since I directly engaged with them, the USTR has kept and by USTR, I'm sorry, I mean the US Trade Representative, has kept up the pressure. And I want to close by talking about what happened in Mexico on July the 1st. The Mexican Congress, without meaningful consultation or debate, enacted a very sweeping new cyber law under the guise of a copyright law. But it goes farther than you may think of when you think about copyright. It would have allowed ventilator manufacturers to decide who could fix ventilators when they were broken. It would have allowed big agribusiness companies like John Deere to decide whether farmers could access the data generated by driving around their own fields. It would have created a regime in which speech that was accused of copyright infringement without any evidence would have to be removed immediately, with virtually no method for remediation and restoring it. It would have overridden legislation that protected people with disabilities who needed to use copyright flexibilities to make adaptive changes to copyrighted works so that they could consume them. For example, feeding an ebook through a text-to-speech engine. And it was passed. I think there's international consensus that the way that this law was passed so quickly was through the agency of the USTR. And as is often the case, when you have rules being passed without this adversarial process of consultation, the rule is so farcically overreaching and so, mustache twirlingly villainous that it was referred immediately by the country's Human Rights Commission to the Supreme Court for constitutional analysis, where it sits now. And that is a rare thing. It's built into the law of Mexico, but it's not a thing that happens very often. And in fact, when you laud the Mexican Human Rights Commission for doing this on Twitter, you will find that Mexican people who care about human rights will say, well, maybe they did this one good thing, but generally speaking, they can hardly be stirred to do anything about human rights abuses. So that tells you just how overreaching this law must have been for them to have finally found a bridge that was too far for them. And so all of this is to say that while it's hard to predict what the character of the Biden administration will be or what life will be like after Brexit, that the USTR has got form, and it's got decades of it, and it's particularly got decades of it when it comes to cyber law, and none of it is good.
Wow. Thank you for that, Corey. That's so we should be worried, I suppose.
Yes. Be afraid, be very afraid.
Thank you. All right, so Anna, let's hear from your perspective about some of the particular threats that we're seeing in the UK already.
Wow, that was quite an introduction. Thank you, Corey. I'm going to cover a little bit of the same ground, but dumb it down a bit. Corey is far too expert for me. I've got a presentation, which I hope it will help to break the flow. So I'm going to share it now, if you can see it on the screen. Can everybody see it? Good. And you can hear me okay. So thank you very much for...
We can see your notes though.
Can you see my notes?
Yeah, not like last time.
Oh, right.
That's better.
Okay. So I just wanted to give you some context to begin with. I know a little bit about US-EU affairs because I've been working a long time with the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, which is a forum of 70 plus European and United States consumer and digital rights groups. So we've been working together with the groups in the US on trade issue and including the EU-US trade agreement that has failed called TTIP. So I would support very much what Corey has said about the strength and the influence that the USTR has in this affair. Another thing to bear in mind, and I don't know whether your audience knows these issues, but the US does not have a general data protection law on the US level. It's got a few sectoral laws, and California significantly has just implemented a general data protection law. But on the national federal level, the US data protection situation is literally the Wild West, where your data, your personal data, can be abused and exploited at will. And there's plenty of evidence for that, including in the UK. But if you don't believe me, I urge everybody to watch these new documentaries that have just been released. One is called Coded Bias, which is absolutely brilliant. And the other one is called The Social Dilemma, which I know Corey doesn't like very much, but nevertheless, it explains the situation very well. So as a result of the US not having a data protection law, and the European Union and the UK have very strong data protection law in the form of GDPR, until recently there was this arrangement called Privacy Shield between the European Union and the US, whereby you could transfer the data from one to another. Well, that has been struck down back in July. by the European Court of Justice, precisely for the reason that Cory has explained. The US surveillance system has huge tentacles into commercial data, and more significantly, it treats foreigners, i.e. non-US residents, differently from those that live in the US. So there was a major human rights infringement and the court struck it down. That will apply to the UK, of course, even after Brexit, because UK residents are not US residents and they will be treated differently. So now I'll go back to trade. This is an article that appeared recently in The Guardian, which basically, according to all the news, the new Biden administration is not very likely to enter into a trade agreement with the UK or anybody else anytime soon. But what we see there at the bottom from an anonymous source, that the core elements of the deal have been negotiating secret since March. They are already in place, and politically, according to this source, it's very uncontroversial. It is forward-leaning in areas like digital and data. So having said that, I will speculate what might be in terms of data flows and source code in such a future trade agreement with the US. The UK government has stated that the new arrangements in its trade deals are very forward-looking and innovative. Well, here's a comparison of two articles. One is on personal data transfers in the UK-Japan deal, and the other one is a 2-year-old US-Mexico-Canada agreement. I'm not going to read them all to you, but what this demonstrates is that A, there is nothing new in the UK formulation with a Japan agreement, because it's more or less reproduces what has been 2 years ago in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. But the most important issue about that is that the language is very trade oriented. It supports very free transfers of personal data between the two trading partners, and you can only overwrite it for public legitimate purposes, but you have to apply very strict trade consideration to it. Nothing about it being a human right or a fundamental right, which is incidentally the phraseology the European Union has proposed in its trade agreement. So this is clearly a departure from the provisions in the strong data protection legislation in the UK, leaning more towards a voluntary type of protection that we are not used to, and actually may contradict the GDPR. Whether that's forward-looking, as the UK government claims, or actually a backward step in terms of people's rights, is depending on your point of view. I mean, obviously, our point of view is that is very strongly a backward step. And also, one key issue, of course, is how is it going to reconcile with a provision in our data protection laws, which require strong protections and are based also on human rights consideration. And finally, how they're going to help business, because under these conditions, getting adequacy for transferring data between UK and the EU is going to be much more difficult. And most of our trading arrangements at the moment are with our neighbors in Europe, not so much with other countries. The other issue I wanted to cover is source code and algorithm. Again, this is a provision that is present both in the UK deal with Japan, is likely to be in its deals with the US, but it's also proposed by the European Union and others. Sorry, I've just noticed, I'll go back a minute. I've just noticed that my text does not match the source code language, so please ignore it. The provision on source code essentially prohibit any disclosure of the source code, with a possible exception of very sort of focused regulatory investigations. This is, from our point of view, problematic because source code and algorithms, they are not defined in this trade agreement, and they can encompass everything. Computer software, the algorithm, the interfaces, in short, all the artificial intelligence systems, which are very much in its infancy, under development, and a lot of governments, including the UK, are still grappling with how to make them more transparent, accountable, and which part of them to make so. So including something like this in a trade agreement, it actually creates a chilling effect and freezes any possible policy or regulatory development for the future. And we do not consider this is a good idea, and I'm happy to elaborate more on it. Finally, I want to have a little rant about transparency, or lack thereof, on the part of the UK government in its trade negotiations. From our perspective and from where we sit, these negotiations, including the one with the US, are happening in total secret. There are no texts available. There are no post-round briefings available to stakeholders or even to Parliament. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I cannot see them. There are a number of trade advisory groups that are heavily business dominated and under long-term gagging orders. There is not clear if public views are taken on board. There's been a consultation about the US objectives, but we cannot see how the views expressed there, for example, about the need to have data protection, have been translated in the actual provision. We cannot see any detailed analysis for the various decisions. And from where I sit, Parliament seems to be as much in the dark as the rest of us, with only a short space given to reflect on very, very complex deals, for example, the Japan deal. And I must say that this is in sharp contrast with current EU practice. The EU publishes all its texts, it publishes the mandates, it briefs the Parliament regularly, it has balanced stakeholder expert groups, I know, because I've been on 2 of them. And so, that this is something, and, I'm glad Damian Collins is with us, because please do transmit this to your colleagues, because it is not good enough what's going on. Finally, I want to give you a quote from a very important piece of research work which the consumer organization has done recently via a citizen forum consultation called National Trade Conversation. And as you can see, when informed, consumers were mostly negative about the US negotiating objective and felt they reflected an aggressive and uncompromising approach. And also they didn't know that the US had much lower level of consumer and security in the USA compared to the UK, and they wanted reassurance that a future trade deal with the US would not compromise the levels of data protection they currently enjoy. And I conclude here. Thank you very much for your attention.
You're muted, Jim.
Sorry, I did click it. I promise I clicked it. Thank you, Anna. That was really informative and a good basis, I think, for the conversation we're going to have. So lastly, Damian Collins, who's, as mentioned, an MP, has worked very much on these issues, has been following the data protection debate very closely in relation to trade. To speak next.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. I think this is a very timely discussion because of the process of approving trade agreements the UK is now engaged in, and I think particularly topical given the UK-Japan trade agreement that's just been published, or recently published, and the role that data protection plays within trade. I sort of believe very firmly that our data protection laws are enshrined in legislation in Parliament, and they should only be amended by legislation in Parliament, and that we shouldn't use trade agreements to try and establish new legal precedents. And that, therefore, I think it's perfectly right that we raise questions about the data adequacy arrangements that are part of trade deals to make sure that they don't in any way create a backdoor to the data enforcement regime that we have and that we believe we have created. We don't want to see a situation where we can say, well, we have these rights, we have GDPR established in UK law, but if you're an international business and you can, through a trade agreement, move UK citizens' data to another country to be processed there under a trade agreement, do so with less oversight or less responsibility or liability for how you do that. Now, I think in the context of the UK and Japan trade agreement, I mean, the government's position is that the arrangements are such that our data laws would still apply. A company that processed UK citizens' data in Japan would not be free to move that data to the United States or another country to be processed there outside of UK law. That would be a breach of data protection law, and the company would have a liability for doing that. But I think it is right that we have that debate to say, well, how easy is it to enforce those laws in a different country? How easy would it be to trace whether these trade agreements are being used as a backdoor to take UK citizens' data to a jurisdiction where the data protection laws are much lighter, much less onerous, and it will be very difficult for a UK citizen to take any enforcement, to seek any enforcement under GDPR to recover that data or understand how it's being used. So, the digital and data provisions in trade are very different from most of the other sort of sections of the trade agreement. And I think one of the reasons for that is that a lot of what governs trade is, certainly in physical goods, is proximity. We tend to do the most trade with the countries that are nearest to us, and there's a reason for that. It's cheaper to move goods between countries that are quite close. It's not surprising we've done a lot of trade with the EU for that reason, and also because we have common rules and regulations and free trade as well. But obviously those rules don't really apply quite the same way as when you're talking about citizens' data and digital policy, where it's a global network where moving data around the world is not difficult to do, and there's no prohibitive cost in doing that. So I think those trade agreements do form a very important part of our data protection regime for that reason, and we need to make sure that the trade agreements don't undermine it. I'd like to see a sort of formal role for the Information Commissioner in looking at these trade agreements and advising Parliament on them. I think that would do a good deal to reassure people that the Information Commissioner is content that the rules can be enforced and that they've got the power to take enforcement action in foreign jurisdictions if need be, if they feel our laws are being undermined through trade agreements. I mean, I've looked at the negotiations for the UK-US trade agreement, and those are presented, I think, again, questions around data protection and what the data adequacy arrangements would be. I think they pose other more direct questions, though, because of the requirement, the desire of the American administration so far to include the liability shield Section 230 provisions in a UK-US trade agreement. The Americans did this in the Mexico, Canada, and Japan trade agreements. And this is a new thing, sort of post the election of Donald Trump as president. In the transatlantic negotiations between the US and the EU, the TTIP negotiations, there was no requirement at that stage that these American laws would be included in the trade agreement. And I think it's important for lots of reasons. Firstly, I think creating a liability similar to Section 230 in UK law is really something that should be left to the UK Parliament to decide. It's not something that I would support, but nevertheless, it certainly shouldn't just be something that slipped into a trade agreement. And secondly, if it were, it would massively undermine our ability to legislate on things like online harms, because there you're looking to create new liabilities for social media companies to act against harmful content and other material that can cause harm, and to have a liability for that, certainly when it's being amplified by their technology. Now, I've raised this on numerous occasions with the Department for International Trade, and I'm reassured that the government has pushed back against the American negotiators and said that it wouldn't accept this provision, wouldn't certainly accept any provisions in a trade deal that would undermine its ability to legislate on online harms. So obviously I welcome that, but I think we have to keep a close eye on the detail of it. Now, since the negotiations started in earnest sort of in April time, obviously a lot has happened, but then it was hoped that an agreement might be reached before this autumn, and obviously that's now not happened, and therefore it'll be down to the new Biden administration to pick up on these negotiations. I heard what Anna said. I've read the reports in the press as well, that it looks like the new Biden administration is going to be in no hurry to rush into concluding trade agreements. And I would think, given the changing nature of the debate in America on Section 230, there may be less appetite now to lock that into trade agreements, and it may be less likely as well that the Democrats in Congress would approve the trade agreement if it were inserted. But I think for me, it's clear that the big tech companies have been lobbying for trade agreements to be used in this way, to try and lock into international law agreements that would suit them. And I'm sure if there was any ambiguity here, that would be exploited by them to take legal action against any enforcement, to tie the courts up for years in deciding whether the domestic legislation or the trade agreement took primacy in this place. So I think we have to recognize there is quite a big lobby from these international companies to use trade to create a regime that suits them, to try and influence digital policy in other countries in ways that suits them, all of which really seek to make it easier for them to process data in jurisdictions with the lightest regulations and to limit them from liability. And I think it's right that we speak about that and we challenge that where we see it. I think finally there's another point too I think we need to consider, which is that as we see more trade agreements in digital trade and data policy, I do think we need to think about what global minimum standards should be in that regard. And actually whether a company that's headquartered still in the UK or the EU or the US could still be held to some sort of standards for the work they do elsewhere in the world. We've seen this in other sectors, certainly in terms of financial services and financial conduct and fraud. We see this with the UK Bribery Act. We see this in America with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I think we need to think of what legal framework should there be to say, even if a company was a British or American company was complying with law in the UK and the US and the EU, but was doing things somewhere else in the world that was far below those standards, should that be considered to be a breach? And also, what will be the role for legal liability to be established against companies then, so that in other sectors, and I think financial services is a good example, we don't expect the regulatory bodies to do all of the sleuthing. So other people can bring cases and investigate and determine potential breaches of the law and have access to the courts to prosecute them. And I think if the companies felt there was a sense of liability on some of these issues where breaches do occur, then they may be more effective at policing themselves. And that job would certainly be a lot easier if it wasn't just left to government regulators to do all of that work.
Thank you, Damian. So that's been three, I think, quite insightful talks there, giving us a broad overview of what is happening in trade from a number of different perspectives. And I think the overall theme we're getting is that there are areas to worry about. This is something we've got to look at closely because the impacts can be pretty harsh. One question one other sort of theme is what kind of information is actually needed to hold government to account on these. And we've talked, we heard the example in Mexico where there was virtually no debate and all kinds of things were agreed to which never really should have ever ended up in a trade agreement. You heard a little bit about what's happened in Europe to try to make sure that the European Parliament has information. And then in the UK context, we're also talking about the, does the Japan agreement potentially affect data protection or not? And at least from where I'm sitting, I think the honest answer is nobody really knows. And it's extremely difficult to understand the legal risks that flow from the treaty. So I guess a question I've just put to everybody is what does Parliament need to do, and what does civil society need in order to actually hold trade agreements to account, and what do the public need in order to understand what these trade agreements mean? I think I'll start in the order we went for this first question. So Corey, if you want to start.
Sure. I mean, I think that we could talk about kind of complex forms of transparency, logging the number of minutes that lobbyists spend with MPs or negotiators or what have you. But I think, there's some baselines that have been missing in US, particularly US-led trade agreements that should be non-controversial. So for example, with the failed Trans-Pacific, or what was it? Gosh, I just blanked the name. TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Not only were the drafts all kept secret, members of the US Congress who were invited to review the drafts weren't allowed to talk about them with their staffers. The places in which the negotiations took place, the hotels in which they took place, were also kept secret. When those hotels' location became known, people who wanted to hold informational sessions for negotiators on the complex nuances that might be missing were excluded from the hotel. The hotels were pressurized to cancel their room blocks and their ballroom bookings. So, I think that there's a lot of really important technical nuance. Anna talked a little about the question of algorithms. I mean, when we talk about deep learning systems, we're now starting to understand that there's an enormous variance in the performance of a deep learning system based on the random initialization values of the nodes in the neural network. And so auditing a deep learning system without knowing things as seemingly trivial as the kind of the random values you initialize the system with, which are supposed to be irrelevant to the statistical inferences that it makes, but turn out to be enormously salient to the performance of the system in the world. So if we're going to audit that, we're going to definitely need a higher degree of transparency. But before we even get there, right, when we're arguing, rather than arguing about the fit of the clothes, let's just argue about whether or not we should be nude. And I think that we should have some clothes on this transparency mandate, that we should know what the drafts say, we should know who's negotiating them, that those negotiations, even if they take place behind closed doors, that they're reported on in public, that people who have disagreements or can offer informational nuance to them should be present and should be invited to attend. I recall once when I was teaching a grad school for people who had been involved in international trade agreements on tech and IP, that I spoke to someone from a Central American country who had been their information minister during the US negotiations on CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. And they got a call from their agriculture negotiator saying, the US trade representative says that they won't take our soybeans unless we give them anti-circumvention. Should we give them anti-circumvention? She says, no, absolutely not. That's terrible. And he said, well, we really need soybeans, and hung up the phone, and they gave them anti-circumvention. And so you definitely want stakeholders in the room who can explain these technical nuances. But let's just start with the fundamental foundational basics. Tell us when you're meeting, tell us where you're meeting, let us come, tell us what you decide, tell us how the negotiations are going, let us see the drafts as they proceed. That to me is just such a minimum standard of care, and I don't think that anyone can really argue with it. I mean, the thing we used to say about TPP is they're not keeping it a secret because they want you to be pleasantly surprised and they don't want to spoil it.
Exactly. I know, Damian, you have to go fairly shortly, I think. Is that right? So I might ask you to sort of give us your perspective on how you feel knowledge has been on the current trade agreements, and whether you think Parliament is getting sufficient time and input at this point.
Sure. Yeah, I have to go at 5 o'clock, so I can say I'll stay on the line, but I might have to jump off at that. I'll jump off at 5 if we're still talking. So, I mean, sometimes it's a question of piecing things together. So, it became clear that the with UK-US trade agreement that it was going to. Well, so taking a step back. So, the UK has been doing two things. It's been seeking rollover trade agreements with. Based on the existing EU trade agreements. So there, in some ways, in most cases, most of what's in those trade agreements is really based on agreements we already have. In some areas, they go further, and the Japan trade agreement goes further in digital and data. So it's important to understand what's there. Now, the agreement's been published. Parliament gets, I think, 28 sitting days to analyse the text and to raise questions, and has got the power to effectively block the agreement, but not necessarily to amend it. And we had a debate in government time on the contents of the agreement as well. I mean, in the UK, the negotiation treaty has always been prerogative of the government, using as an exercise of the raw prerogative, and Parliament has to be consulted. The question there is, I think, with trade agreements is, what Parliament could always amend, introduce new legislation in the future which would override areas of the trade agreement. One Parliament can't bind the next in that regard. The important thing is on enforcement. So when you look at something like the Japan trade agreement, so if it's part of the agreement, we believe that we've got an agreement that the UK authorities will be supported by the authorities in Japan to seek enforcement action against a company that's breached the terms of the agreement. Then that can give you hopefully some reassurance that the agreement will be enforced efficiently and effectively. But that's why I also think as part of that process is that often just being given the raw text, different people can interpret that in different ways, and having the input of official bodies in that is important. So the government is establishing a new body to look at agriculture and food standards within trade agreements to advise Parliament on what the agreement means in reality. We've already got the Information Commissioner in the UK that can do that on data protection law as well. So I think for these bodies to be almost, consultees, and there may be stages, I say this as a parliamentarian, I do think sometimes that the negotiators have got the right to negotiate until the texts are in a sufficiently developed state to make them worth being shared, and that point is when you feel you're getting close to agreement, so that what's being published is based on what the agreement that's likely to be there. It'd be perfectly understandable for negotiating teams to start with a whole series of outlier positions they don't expect to be in the initial agreement. But I think it would be helpful, is before the agreement is signed, that you get to see what it is, or at least when there's the agreement in principle, even if the text is still being checked by the lawyers, that at that point you can start to share what the agreement in principle is based on. That would certainly help with scrutiny.
Thank you. Anna.
Right, I've got a lot to say on this, but I'll be brief because I don't disagree at all with what Corey said and also largely with what Damian said. But I think there's two issues about the negotiation. A, as Damian and Corey mentioned, the more input you have from experts and the public at large, the better you understand what you need to do. If there is no input, I showed you the photograph of the negotiating room. It's a very homogeneous group. It doesn't reflect the population diversity or the whole range of experiences in the population. Secondly, this thing about secrecy. I think, yes, I agree that tariff negotiations are important to keep secret because you don't want to give your hand on what goods you negotiate. But nowadays, most of these agreements are about regulatory barriers. They're about policy and regulation. There is, and they don't reinvent the wheel every time they have an agreement. It's usually, they use the same policies they used in other agreements, and they're adjusted according to the demands of the partner. So there's no reason on earth why at least they cannot publish the latest version of a text, not every time there is a discussion, but at least periodically. Secondly, why not brief the Parliament regularly? Come during the negotiations or post-negotiations, come and give a brief to the Parliament so that they understand what to expect, so that they can question the the rationale, because by the time it gets to their decision, yes or no, it's too late. And actually, you know, I'm sorry to invoke this again, but when I first started working on TTIP, for example, there was complete secrecy on the EU side. Nothing was there. Then Cecilia Malmström from Sweden came in and DG Trade Commissioner, and Sweden has a very big tradition of transparency. And she introduced all these transparency measures into the EU negotiations, and they were largely transformed, and the officials themselves recognized that actually it helped them. It's not deterred them from having effective and efficient negotiations. And the second thing I wanted to say, if you look, for example, at the Which Citizen Forum research, they started with a sort of number, you know, representative number of the UK population that knew nothing about trade when they started. And at the end of the process, they understood pretty well what trade was about, and they had a very rational, very educated policy opinion. So this idea that, you know, people are too, you know, naive to understand trade lawyers and complexity of trade is absolutely not correct. And you know, so the UK current system, from our point of view, is not satisfactory either for parliamentary democracy and you know, sovereignty, or for the population at large. So please modify it.
Thank you. So I'm going to come on to a set of questions we've had from people mostly watching on YouTube. I'm glad to say there's quite a lot. Because there's quite a lot, I think I'm going to read a few of these out, and I'll just ask people to kind of one by one give a little bit of a response to which bits they want. So Damian, a few of these are for you. There's a few people kind of worried about how well we will do our negotiations compare, and how well we'll hold companies to account once we're doing this for ourselves. One asks, the facts are that the EU has acted against Microsoft, Facebook, Google, Amazon. UK has not. What makes you, Damian, confident that we can going forward? And similarly, people suggested that Google be broken up and search made a utility. Should the world be more scared by the prospect of a US utility covering the globe? What should the UK do? That's also for Corey, I think. And a more general couple of questions. And this would be really interesting to hear from you, Damian. How can we make sure that the government and Conservative MPs listen to our concerns on digital rights? And then one for Corey, what should digital rights activists do to ensure our rights are protected? So I think we can, if we start with Damian, so a few of those were, I think, for you.
Sure. So I mean, companies that do business in the UK have to abide by our laws now, and certainly after this year, when we're no longer in the single market, you know, the UK will have more say over its internal jurisdiction, whereas in the past some of that would have been based on EU law. So, but I think we have to recognise too, and I think Jason Furman did in his report for the government, for the Treasury, on looking at competition in the digital ad market, is that it's inevitable if you're dealing with very large American companies that the American regulators will probably have the most influence on those companies' policies. But it doesn't mean to say that countries like the UK can't take action in their own jurisdictions as well. You know, and we do, in fact we do. I mean, the Information Commissioner has taken action against Facebook for data breaches, did it with Cambridge Analytica. The GDPR legislation allows the enforcement of much bigger fines now, up to 4%. So, you know, the UK authorities can enforce a fine of 4% of global turnover for those companies. So I think we do need to have, you know, proper sanctions. But in terms of the structural issues around the big tech companies and whether they are utilities and should they be regulated as such, or should they be broken up to ensure fair competition, I think we're seeing a very lively debate around the world on that, being led, you know, in part by the Google, with the Department for Justice's antitrust action against Google in America. Obviously, there's been a lot of work the European Commission has done on that too. The UK is, on the recommendation of the Competition and Markets Authority, setting up its own digital markets unit, and these are all positive steps. I think the direction of traffic, is really at the moment only going in one way, which is greater scrutiny both on content and data policy of the companies, and on competition policy as well. I think it would be good if we could have a kind of Bretton Woods global summit for on certainly from the Western world on tech policy and standards. We might have different enforcement regimes in our different jurisdictions, different legal traditions, which means we have to approach them in slightly different ways. But an understanding of what we think, what principles we think should underpin it. I think particularly on data and on competition. And on content liability, and those three areas. But I think the debate is moving in that direction, and we're being informed by what we're all doing in that regard. I think the UK should take an active interest in what's going on in both the US and in the EU. But I look at I look at the regulators in countries like Canada, which are very active in this space as well. So I think I see us as being part of a global community that is actively engaged in this debate. I do think that there's a growing case to be made to say that the major tech companies, rather than competing against each other, have developed market dominant positions, which could allow abuse of market power, because consumers have very little alternative other than to use those services. So then I think it does then beg the question about how you regulate that under competition policy, and whether they do need to be treated more like utilities rather than competing private companies.
Thank you. And what would you say, just very briefly, because we're not too much time left, but what would you say we should do around influencing the government and the Conservative MPs? What's the right way for digital rights activists to make their concerns heard?
Well, I think ultimately Parliament decides. So the government has to get its legislation through Parliament. Parliament votes. We have an election to determine who sits in Parliament. So people can lobby MPs and lobby Parliament on these issues. And there are also a growing number of all-party groups now focused on different aspects of digital policy, different select committees looking at different aspects of this. And I think not just looking in isolation, but looking at the application of digital policy to not just people's data rights, but also the use of data in the delivery of government services and development of government policy. And so I think there's a very active debate in Parliament now, from lots of different angles. So I think there's a big debate for people to engage in.
Thank you very much. Corey, I know you have to go in a couple of minutes, so I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, I'm trying to fashion a snappy answer to what's a very good question. I've just gone and looked in the YouTube to see the actual phrasing there. So I think that if you want to understand Google's dominance, which is key to understanding how to unwind Google's dominance, we really have to look at what happened historically. So Google is often, its dominance is attributed to things like network effects, or to first mover advantage, or these other kind of abstract ideas out of economics. But there's very little evidence that that is how Google grew. When you actually look at Google's growth strategy, it's the same as all the other tech giants. They grew through anti-competitive mergers. There was a bedrock principle for the 30 or so years after the war in most of the Western world, that firms should not be allowed to grow through anti-competitive mergers with major competitors, through predatory acquisitions of smaller competitors, or through the creation of vertical monopolies that make it impossible to enter adjacent markets. And when you look at Google, it's a company that has made 1.5 successful products, right? They made a really good search engine and a pretty good Hotmail clone. Everything else that they made internally failed. Everything that they did successfully, they bought, including their ad tech stack, including YouTube, from top to tail. They have some operational stuff internally, their cloud and so on, that they made, but those aren't the products that they sell primarily. Android is an acquisition. Same is true of Apple. Tim Cook told Kara Swisher in January of 2019 that he bought 40 companies in the previous quarter, prompting Swisher to say that she buys groceries less often than Tim Cook buys companies. Facebook bought Instagram and WhatsApp. And so, when we talk about sorting this, I think the first thing that we need to do is look at anti-competitive conduct, because the harms that arise here are not the harms of a lack of consideration for liability. Indeed, stronger liability regimes just favor companies with deep pockets. This is why Facebook did an about face on, as did YouTube, on copyright filters in the European Union in 2019, because once they got past the possibility that they could get away with having no filters, they discovered or recognized that filters were a burden that they alone could afford. And that meant that they could just clear the entire game board of anyone who might someday grow to compete with them. Ultimately, if our problem is that these companies are bad at content moderation, and oh my goodness, are they ever bad at content moderation? I think the answer should be that we should have other choices for content moderation. Asking someone who's bad at something to do more of it won't make them good at it. And particularly raising the stakes for making mistakes will just make them more gun shy and more apt to shoot first and ask questions later. And I think that this ripples out through all of the questions that we've talked about here today. This competition question. Anna mentioned that I'm not a fan of the social dilemma. I think that characterizing the big tech companies as evil geniuses does them a real favor, because I think that they will settle for evil geniuses so long as genius is in the title. And when you want to actually look at how they modify our behavior, you have these wild claims made by the likes of Cambridge Analytica or Facebook's sales team that with the right ad tech you can make people believe white is black and up is down, that you can take the mind control ray invented to sell your nephew fidget spinners and use it to turn your uncle into a racist. But the actual thing that we see where they have very gross effects that change our behavior is purely from monopoly and anti-competitive behavior. The largest behavior modification Facebook gets away with every day is holding all of your friends hostage so that the only place you can talk to them is Facebook. If we had interoperability mandates and we had interoperability protection for interoperators, then there could be lots of places that you could go to talk to people on Facebook, whether or not Facebook liked it. And so, I think that markets only work when they're competitive. And this idea that surveillance capitalism is a rogue capitalism because it strips us of our free will ignores the fact that we've seen monopolies rise in every sector. And this is what I want to close on, because it's not just big tech, right? We see concentration in beer, spirits, accounting, finance, pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical insurance, and pharmacies, health insurance, logistics, shipping, professional wrestling. These are not industries that are subject to first mover advantage and network effects. They're just industries where a couple of dominant firms have unlimited access to capital markets to make anti-competitive acquisitions. And the good news about all of that is that we all share a problem, right? Back when the ecology movement wasn't a movement, when it was just 1,000 causes, you care about owls and I care about the ozone layer, we didn't have solidarity, we didn't have a movement. The term ecology united all those issues under a single umbrella, a single movement with 1,000 ways to get involved, 1,000 causes that made it up. And we're really on the verge of that, because there are people who are rightfully very angry about monopoly in every sector. Right? If your local council can't provide services because Carillion collapsed, and you looked and you saw that the big four accounting firms signed off on their grossly fraudulent books and then got the contract to unwind them, then you are angry about monopoly, not about Carillion. And you should be angry and out there fighting for anti-monopoly on Facebook. And the people who are worried about anti-monopoly on Facebook will be fighting your corner in anti-monopoly in the big four accounting firms. And I think ultimately this is the only way that we get around this. We can fix the internet or we can fix the tech companies, but we can't fix both. Deputizing the tech companies to serve as an arm of the state to solve the problems that they created just rewards them for their malfeasance. And then all it does is set an example for future monopolists that the way to get away with your crimes is to make them indispensable.
Thank you, Corey. And I'm going to ask Anna in a sec, but Corey, because I know you may have to pop off in a sec, I'll just push that question back to you about what digital rights activists should do to ensure our rights are protected. Obviously, working this big coalition you're talking about seems a really good step forward.
So I guess the very last thing, because I do have to jump off in a minute here, is that these are systemic problems. They don't have individual answers. They have systemic organizational and institutional answers. Telling people that they should just shop their way out of monopolies is like telling them they should recycle their way out of climate change. And, you know, I founded Open Rights Group with Danny O'Brien and Sue, how long ago now? 15, 16 years ago, in part because we need institutional solutions. You're not going to solve this with individual choice.
Okay, well, thank you. Damian's had to go. It's bang on 5 o'clock. Anna, you've spoke at least in that last little bit, so I'll give you the opportunity to just come back with a few thoughts, as I'm sure we'll have to round it up in a second or two, a couple of minutes. Yeah.
What do you want me to answer? Do you want me to say a bit more on how to deal with this tech platform dominance? Do you want me to say a little bit more about I can't remember, there were so many important questions.
There were an enormous number of thank you also, Corey, as I got to leave now. Yeah, just I think maybe we should just focus in on the trade questions and say, well, what have we got to worry about the most, and what steps are next for us to take as digital rights activists? What should we be telling MPs? Who should we be telling to worry?
Okay, so I think a major issue that we need to do as a community is fight in the UK for some degree of transparency, at least some kind of involvement of the Parliament in this issue. Maybe also looking at agreed treaties to actually do some more sort of training, educational conversations with members of Parliament to actually involve them more in this process, because it is a very complex one. International trade law is very difficult. It can affect UK sovereignty, and at least we engage more the members of Parliament is not going to happen. And I think we also somehow, particularly on adequacy and data protection issues, should get into more alliances with British business. You know, there are many law-abiding companies out there that want to do the right thing, that do trade with Europe, and we are constantly talking about the platforms and the monopolies and these guys that have enormous power, which is right that we should do. But we should also concentrate on collaboration with startups and other tech companies. On this issue of platform power, I mean, part of the problem has been that competition law, both in the US and the EU and everywhere, has always looked at markets and economic issues. They have not considered the power of amassing huge amounts of private information into the hands of these platforms. And, you know, there is now a case going on in Europe about the Google Fitbit acquisition, which is the kind of acquisition that Corey was talking about. And one of the actions civil society is taking is actually being witnesses in those investigations. For example, in the Google Fitbit acquisition, the European Consumer Group is a witness, and so is Privacy International. So having this kind of expert witness from the civil society in considerations like that, it's enormously valuable.
Well, yeah, thank you, Anna. So, and also just thank everyone for listening today. I think that's been a really, really interesting conversation. I've been struck by how much underlying agreement there actually is, even between people who've got kind of different perspective about where the worries in trade are. Clearly, platform power is a really, really big thing for most people now. The question is, what is the right approach? And for trade agreements, are these trade agreements going to enable us to be able to deal with platforms properly, or are they going to actually make it harder? From the last few weeks, I think we've been very worried by the lack of information and scrutiny on the Japan deal. The information Anna was showing us about how these agreements are replicated elsewhere, I think is also a really, really important one. But I also think we've got our work cut out. There's going to be a couple of years now when this is going to be an extremely big kind of issue to deal with. The threats are going to come thick and fast, and we're going to find that the results of that could be pretty disastrous pretty quickly if we really don't work hard on this. And so I'd like to thank everyone for listening. We'll be having another of these discussions in a couple of weeks, and we hope to have more of them over the coming months as well. So thanks everyone again. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel and so on. Keep in touch with us on email. And if you're not already a member of Open Rights Group, of course, please do join and help us fight a good cause here.